First of all, I would like to say thank you to Radek, my dear friend, for inviting me here today, and to all of you who came here to listen to this paper. I'm happy to be back in Warsaw, and I hope to come back a few more times after this one. So the topic today is learning Latin in the Roman army. I gave my presentation the title Learning Latin in the Roman Army, and that is, of course, what I will be talking about. But perhaps I should have added the subtitle, and how soldiers and veterans contributed to the diffusion of Latin in the provinces. For this aspect of the subject is evidently of eminent importance for the linguistic development of the provinces of the Roman Empire. I will therefore also, this will also be at the core of the next 45 minutes or so. So let us begin. All good? Yeah? Yes. Okay. Young men from a great many different ethnic and linguistic backgrounds served in the Roman imperial army during the first 4 centuries. The one you see here, for instance, came from the tribe of the Treviri in Gallia Belgica. Although we know of well over 50 ethnic groups that contributed entire units or large parts thereof to the auxiliary forces of the Roman army. Some such units originally even grouped soldiers from various different tribes or peoples together who did not necessarily speak the same language or dialect. The written records of individual soldiers show many more ethnicities to have contributed to the military personnel of the Roman imperial army. When ethnic auxiliary units were first raised in the provinces, very few of their soldiers, if any, will have spoken Latin as a second language. Moreover, as we will see, the recruitment of auxiliary soldiers from the provinces whose mother tongue was not Latin seems to have remained considerable throughout the imperial period. Yes, this was a gravestone I wanted to show you. Joining the army, even the auxilia provided the opportunity for these young provincials to get acquainted with the Latin language, as Latin was the official language of the Roman army. The writing tablet from Vindolanda that you see in this picture will help to set the scene. It illustrates to some extent both the linguistic diversity in everyday life of the Roman soldiers of the late 1st century AD, particularly in the auxilia, as well as the possible difficulties that could arise from it. The slide shows the fragment of a letter written by one Masclus, a cavalry decurion, to Iulius Vericundus, the prefect of an auxiliary unit, the cohors prima tungrorum. Now, this unit differed somewhat from other auxiliary units in that it contained well into the 2nd century, it continued well into the 2nd century to receive recruits from the same Germanic region where it was originally raised. Masclus, however, wrote on behalf of Cives Raeti, that is, men from the province of Raetia. Their mother tongue, therefore, probably was Raetian, a language of non-Indo-European origin. The other 3 men, whom Masclus described as de vocontiis, may also have been Raetians, if de vocontiis simply referred to the ala vocontiorum, an auxiliary unit in which they served. All 5 men, it seems, were under the overall command of the prefect Iulius Vericundus. They had asked Masclus to forward in writing, as was required, their petition for leave to the prefect. Perhaps none of these 5 men could write, even though they may have been able to speak and understand some Latin. Yet why they approached Masclus with their request is not clear. Perhaps Masclus was a Raetian himself. If so, he was no doubt not just literate, but also bilingual. But maybe he was just a trusted under-officer who was known to be able to write successful petitions to the prefect. In that case, at least one of the Raetians was capable of expressing himself in Latin. We will return to situations like this later on, but we can already see that the army was not only home to many ancient languages, but that Latinity and literacy were unevenly distributed in the army. This map shows the approximate expansion of the Roman Empire. Like practically all published maps of the empire, it is not entirely complete and also not entirely correct. Nevertheless, it is sufficient for our purposes because it gives a good impression of the extraordinary extent of the empire with its provinces, i.e. the many territories that Rome conquered outside Italy or otherwise incorporated into its dominions. Obviously, before the arrival of the Romans, countless native languages and dialects were spoken in these vast areas, which in turn belonged to a large number of language families and groups. Of course, in many places, these languages survived the arrival of the Romans. In rare cases, the descendants of these languages even survive into our time, like Gaelic or Manx and others. As you all know, of course, the empire was divided linguistically into two parts, a Latin West and a Greek-speaking East. This immediately demonstrates that the Romans did not spread the Latin language throughout the empire. However, we must also admit that this map, again, is not really very precise. For smaller areas and societies in the Greek-speaking East did exist, where Latin was indeed spoken. These exclaves included, above all, Roman colonies. However, we do not need to deal with these any further today. Countless written testimonies from all over the empire, including, of course, the provinces, attest the use of Latin script and language. According to recent estimates, well over 500,000 inscriptions, perhaps many more, have survived. This may sound like a large number, but it is only a small fraction of the inscriptions that were once mass-produced during the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd centuries. Of course, papyrus was also used as writing material, as were wooden writing tablets. Literary works or letters were written on such writing materials, as well as administrative documents and lists or legal contracts and other records. Countless other Latin inscriptions, often only very short, were scratched or punched into pottery, wood, or metal. Such small inscriptions bear witness to the use of the Latin alphabet and language, at least to a certain degree, by people of a lower social position, at least in certain contexts. One thing emerges very clearly from our sources. Latin was written wherever the Roman army was stationed and as soon as it arrived. Inscriptions, administrative documents, letters, contracts, records, notices, etc., were written in Latin, the official language of the army. Nevertheless, it was recently claimed by several scholars that Latin was in fact not the army's official language. I don't think that is a sustainable hypothesis. The basis for it comes from several Greek documents and letters known from military contexts in the eastern provinces, Egypt in particular. However, these documents were of secondary significance compared to those written in Latin, and they were of short-lived importance. All known important army documents are only known in Latin, like Pridiana, for example. Moreover, soldiers had to speak Latin words or formulas in certain situations, both in groups and as individuals. For example, once a year, they had to take a formulaic military oath in Latin. Every morning, they had to take a Latin vow of obedience. Also, all passwords were in Latin, even in the Greek East. And finally, the tactical orders were given in Latin. This was still the case in the Byzantine army of the 6th and 7th centuries. Thus, for example, before an attack, an officer, shouted, "Parati," ready. And a second officer then shouted, "Adiuta," and the soldiers responded, "Deus," help us God. All this should remind us that even in the imperial times, the Roman army was the Exercitus Populi Romani, the army of the Roman people. And Latin, after all, was the language of the Romans. It is often thought that the Roman army played a major role in the spreading of Latin in the Latin language, at least in the western part of the empire, as it was the only Roman institution that maintained relatively large numbers of people with any knowledge of Latin in the provinces. Most of these people were legionary soldiers who served for 25 years and, in a first phase, came from northern Italy and the Romanized areas of southern Gaul and the Iberian Peninsula. Later, since the late first and early second centuries, more and more of them were recruited in the frontier provinces. In this slide, you see the well-known tombstone of the centurion Marcus Caelius from Bononia, today's Bologna in northern Italy, who died in the Varus battle in 9 AD. With him, his two servants, who may also have come from Bononia. Soldiers who were married before their military service often brought along their wives, while unmarried legionaries often founded families with local women. After their service in the legions, many of these soldiers stayed in the provinces with their families, either as part of a state-organized settlement scheme in veteran colonies, or simply on an individual and voluntary basis. This tombstone from the legionary fortress of Vindonissa in modern Switzerland belongs to a soldier's wife, who was also from Bononia, modern Bologna, as well as to her servant. Other veterans, however, returned to their former homes after discharge. Unfortunately, it is not possible to say which was the larger group. However, there is another far more important group of soldiers in the Roman army that appear to have been particularly suited to spread Latin throughout the provinces. I'm talking about the soldiers of the auxiliary troops. They were about as numerous as the legionary soldiers, and during most of the first 3 centuries, they hailed from non-Latin speaking communities in the provinces. As Latin was the official language also in the auxilia, these men were exposed to the language of the Romans during their 25 years of military service. A total of several million young men whose mother tongue was not Latin thus served in the imperial army during the course of the first 3 centuries AD. It was quite common for soldiers from different tribes or peoples who did not speak the same language or dialect to serve together in the same military unit. We saw an example at the beginning of the lecture, that letter from Vindolanda. But few auxiliary soldiers would have spoken Latin at the moment they joined the army, with the exception, of course, of such tribal leaders like the famous Cheruscan Prince Arminius and his brother Flavus, who served as commanders and had acquired a fluent knowledge of Latin at a very early age. But otherwise, the number of soldiers whose mother tongue was not Latin may have remained considerable throughout the imperial period. The Roman army is therefore often considered to have been a kind of linguistic melting point in which hundreds of thousands of young men from almost all parts of the empire learned Latin during their military service and then taught their children and families this language, especially after their discharge from the army, so that Latin gradually spread throughout the provinces of the Roman Empire. However, I'm afraid a closer look at the evidence makes things look a bit more complicated. The mechanism which I just described did indeed exist without any doubt, and not a few soldiers may have learned Latin during their service in the army. It is certainly also true that contact between soldiers and veterans of the Roman army and the native-speaking population contributed to the spread of Latin in the northern provinces. But all this is not very meaningful as long as we have no understanding of the magnitudes in which the Roman army contributed to the diffusion of Latin. When attempting to establish such orders of magnitude, we must first contemplate the possibilities and limits of our sources in this regard. The very first problem that we need to address is the unfortunate fact that our topic is neither discussed nor even touched on in a single ancient source. The number of non-Latin speaking recruits who entered the army each year is unrecorded and therefore unknown, as is the number of those who, during their approximately 25 years of military service, learned Latin to a level that would have enabled them to meaningfully teach others. There is not a single source that would allow us to determine, derive, or gauge the percentage of Latin-speaking or Latin-learning soldiers at any point in time. On the other hand, it is undoubtedly correct to assume that among the recruits for the auxilia, at least in the first century, there were significantly more non-Latin speakers than among the recruits for the legions, and that Latinity and literacy were more common among the higher ranks and officers than among the enlisted men. But if we want to understand the role of the army in spreading the Latin language, we need more details. The best we can do, therefore, is to try to estimate the army's potential for spreading Latin in the provinces. This can perhaps best be done with the help of the number of veterans that were discharged from the auxilia each year, focusing on the auxilia at the moment. For this number can be gauged with the help of several sources, mainly inscriptions, that give us the approximate annual number of new legionary veterans, which was around 3,300. According to Tacitus, about the same number of men served in the auxilia as did in the legions. So we can work with the estimated number of around 3,300 veterans who retired from the auxiliary troops every year. If we assume that not a single one of these men knew Latin as a recruit, then this number, i.e. around 3,300, was the theoretical annual maximum of men who could have learned Latin during their military service in the auxilia and could have spread the language of the Romans throughout the empire after their discharge. To this theoretical maximum number of auxiliary veterans, one could add such legionary and navy soldiers who were also recruited with little or no knowledge of Latin, as well as those soldiers who decided to settle in the northern provinces in spite of their origins in Romanized areas of the empire. Yet this number is most likely to be in the hundreds at the most. Therefore, the resulting annual sum will probably have remained under 5,000. The sum is thus exceedingly small when compared to the estimated 70 to 100 million inhabitants of the Roman Empire in the first 3 centuries. The annually discharged veterans thus made up no more than between about 0.05 and 0.07 per mil of the total population of the empire. If we assume that all auxiliary veterans lived 20 to 25 years after their discharge from the army, which is certainly a gross overestimation, the total veteran population of the auxilia in the Roman Empire would never have exceeded between 1 and 2 per mil of the total population of the Roman Empire. Yet, what is more important than this overall figure is the distribution of the veterans throughout the provinces. Let's start with the populous province of Egypt, where the relevant figures are comparatively well known thanks to the papyri recovered there. Around the middle of the 2nd century, a total of around 280 to 290 soldiers were released annually from the legions and the auxiliaries stationed in the Nile Valley. Most of them became part of the community of around 5 to 10,000 veterans at the most, then living in this province. Others will have returned to their home abroad, mainly in the Balkans and Asia Minor. Thus, the veterans from all the legions and all the auxilia stationed in Egypt made up about 0.1 to 0.2 per mil of the provincial population. It is therefore hardly surprising that the veterans appear to have had no significant influence on the social and economic conditions in the Nile Valley. The same undoubtedly applies to their linguistic influence, especially since most of the auxiliaries that joined the Roman army in Egypt originated from the Nile Valley and therefore simply remained within their original linguistic context. The case of the small Balkan province of Thrace is somewhat different, for the sources show that a particularly large number of young men were recruited in this province. Most of these, however, did not serve in the two auxiliary cohorts that formed the garrison of this tiny province, but were sent to faraway units throughout the empire. The majority of these Thracian soldiers appear to have returned to their old home after their discharge. Thus, the percentage of veterans in the total provincial population was significantly higher than in Egypt. Over the centuries, each Thracian family must have had at least one or more living or deceased soldiers as a member. Nevertheless, especially in rural Thrace, there is nothing to indicate that these veterans at any time significantly promoted the use of Latin. Less than 5% of the soldiers' dedicatory inscriptions are in Latin. Moreover, the Latin of these inscriptions implies that their authors were often not well versed in the language of the Romans. There even seems to have been a tendency to prefer Latin over Greek inscriptions when reusing these stones in building material. It is hardly surprising that the main influence of Latin on the Greek language in Thrace is found in the adoption of a number of military loanwords. The service in the Roman army, which many thousands of Thracians performed during the Principate, thus had an extraordinarily small influence on the linguistic development of their home province. But that is perhaps again not really surprising, since there was little reason for a Thracian veteran to speak Latin after he returned to his Thracian home. Once he was back in his homeland, where everybody understood and spoke his native Thracian tongue and/or Greek, using Latin would have made little sense. The same phenomenon was apparently widespread, as it can also be very clearly observed in Judea or Syria-Palestina. Almost all veteran tombstones here were written in Greek, the common lingua franca in the east of the empire. On the other hand, all the gravestones that were commissioned for soldiers who died during service in this province were invariably written in Latin, the official language of the army. Unfortunately, it is almost impossible to document such phenomena in the western part of the empire, because Latin was practically the only epigraphic language in use. Nevertheless, one may well assume that the linguistic behavior of those who returned from military service to civilian life in the western provinces was not fundamentally different from that of their colleagues in the east. A few very rare cases of non-Latin military inscriptions indeed appear to confirm this theory. One such case is from the small African community of Tullium in a region called Hefia in the hinterland of Hippo Regius, now Annaba in Algeria. Many young men from this region served in the Roman army during the late Republic and the Principate, and it seems many also returned to their North African home after discharge. It is of particular interest, therefore, that many veterans had gravestones with inscriptions in their own local language and script, or bilingual gravestones with one text in Latin, like the one you see on this slide. But let us now turn from veterans to soldiers on active duty. Can we not at least assume for them that they learned Latin and spread it in their garrison provinces? We can surely assume that Latinity was most common in the legions of the late 1st century BC and the early 1st century AD. During those years, the recruiting areas for legionary soldiers, who all had to be Roman citizens, mainly lay in the Romanized parts of northern Italy, southern Gaul, and the Iberian Peninsula. In any case, their contact as soldiers or veterans with the locals in the northern provinces will no doubt have contributed to the spread of Latin. Some of the writing tablets from Vindonissa appear to illustrate this. But even in the early period, we hear of young men who were recruited into the legions without knowing Latin. Some legions were set up entirely from non-Romans, as Legio Quinta Alaude, which Caesar founded in 52 BC, or Legio Vicesima Secunda Deotariana, which was set up after the death of the Galatian king Deiotarus from his former army. Occasional vernacular names on soldiers' tombstones from the early empire, even in northern Italy, like the one you see here, raise the question of whether their bearers had actually learned Latin as their first language. This in turn raises the question of how much Latin was actually needed to serve in the army. As I mentioned earlier, we can be confident that all senior officers and commanders, as well as the soldiers who worked in the staffs and as clerks of their unit, had a command of Latin ranging from fair to excellent. However, their number in each unit was small and amounted to perhaps 10 to 15% at the very most. But what about the rest? Surprisingly, perhaps, it seems that the regular units of the Roman army could indeed function even when most of their soldiers knew little more than the most basic Latin. This is illustrated by the story of a cohort of German Usipetes. Tacitus relates how this cohort was formed in AD 82 from the conquered tribes of Usipetes, and how a legionary centurion and a few Roman soldiers were added to this unit ad tradendam disciplinam. These soldiers should serve as models and instruct the Germans. The very low ratio of Latin speakers to non-Latin speakers was apparently considered sufficient to allow this cohort of Usipetes to function as a regular unit of the Roman army. Perhaps that should not come too much as a surprise, since earlier, in many Hellenistic armies, the linguistic realities must have been comparable. For Greek was also never enforced upon ordinary soldiers as a language of everyday use. Still, the case of the Usipetes reveals a linguistic situation that was no doubt extraordinary, even though it evidently passed as an acceptable minimum for a newly formed auxiliary force. Yet this cohort hardly reflects the situation of the average auxiliary unit in the Roman army. But the Latinity of common soldiers in a more normal auxiliary unit of the Roman army also occasionally appears to have been of low quality. Thus, Tacitus reports of multilingual Roman armies on the Rhine and in the East in 69 and 70 AD. He was particularly disparaging about the wild Germanic appearance and the horridus sermo, the horrible language of the soldiers of the Rhine army. Tacitus also called the soldiers of this army peregrini et externi, and described the army as foreign-speaking and culturally different. Exercitus linguis moribusque dissonos. The historian saw the reason for the lack of Romanness of these soldiers in their permanent bases on the Rhine. In other words, Tacitus contributed the Germanic nature of the Rhine army to its exposure to a Germanic environment and to its recruitment of Germanic locals. That, in his view, was the reason for the terrible language of these soldiers. But if true, that would describe a process that was rather the opposite of an army spreading language in non-Latin speaking regions. In Tacitus' judgment, which of course we do not need to take at face value, the Rhine army was becoming more and more Germanic. A small group of 9 Latin ostraca from Egypt's eastern desert, associated with a Thracian soldier named Cutus, may perhaps illustrate the kind of horridus sermo to which Tacitus referred. These ostraca, nearly all of which are fragmentary, date to the Flavian period and contain over 25 bizarre misspellings and errors of morphology and syntax. They have recently been published in the ZPE by Jim Adams and Rodney Ast. I've chosen pictures of 5 of them for you just to give you an impression of what they look like. The ostraca contain 5 short letters, 3 very fragmentary documents, and 1 list of mainly Thracian cavalrymen, all drawn up in fairly consistent, albeit somewhat idiosyncratic handwriting. According to Adams and Ast, quote, Cutus was a very bad speller, but there is enough evidence in these very short documents to show that he had some control of the Latin verb and noun systems. The variety of Latin with which he was familiar was substandard, not educated, end of quote. Cutus's Latin was subject to Greek influence, but his bad spelling did not necessarily derive from a Thracian accent. It does, however, reveal him to have been a learner of Latin, and it is surely likely that he acquired his skills of the Roman language during his military service. Moreover, his correspondence with a curator, a significator, and a sesquiplicarius seem to betray a degree of professional ambition, which may have set Cutus apart from many of the rank and file in his unit. There we go. Similarly, over a century later, the future emperor Maximinus, as a young soldier and barely capable of speaking Latin, is said to have publicly addressed the emperor Septimius Severus, quote, in almost pure Thracian. Although this passage is from the very hostile accounts against Maximinus, the proposition as such is no doubt based on a more or less plausible notion. Therefore, we can safely assume that Thracians and other provincial soldiers, even at the end of the 2nd century, often joined the Roman auxilia with little or no knowledge of Latin. Nevertheless, such soldiers apparently could improve their Latinity over the course of their service, and some, like Maximinus, arrived at superior levels. The recruitment of non-Latin speakers to the auxilia, even in the 3rd century, is indeed supported by various other documentary sources, such as, for instance, the ostraca from Bungem, a small North African fort in the desert. The correlation between rank on the one hand and Latinity and literacy on the other also clearly emerges from the written evidence from this fort. This material shows or allows one to study the significant contrast between, on the one hand, a handful of Latin inscriptions that were set up by legionary centurions, including in some cases poems by these officers, and, on the other hand, nearly 150 ostraca with notes and records written by what you might call soldier scribes of the administrative offices of the auxiliary cohors octava fila. The slide shows 2 of these documents. The ostraca betray their authors to have been mostly North Africans who acquired Latin as a second language and who had not, or not yet, achieved fluent competence in that language. In fact, the ostraca from Bungem suggest that these military scribes were given exemplars to follow, when they had to compose standard texts, and that they constantly made mistakes when free composition was required. In another case, an ostrakon from an outpost in Egypt's eastern desert suggests that a Greek-speaking soldier with only a shaky grasp of Latin may have used a phrase book or a glossary to translate mechanically from Greek to Latin. The use of such tools as exemplars and phrase books was therefore no doubt also common among the soldiers in the West. At any rate, Jim Adams called the African soldiers at Bujem, who were struggling with to get their Latin right, imperfect learners of Latin. No doubt, these soldiers spoke to each other in their own mother tongue and had a local accent when using Latin. However, it remains unclear who their Latin teachers may have been and whether they were indeed still in the process of learning Latin. For what it's worth, one might note that none of the ostraka from Bujem contains passages from Virgil's works, whereas quite a few tablets from Vindolanda do. Moreover, the evidence both at Vindolanda and at Bujem fails to reveal distinct groups of military scribes at different levels of learning. Just as the beginners appear to be largely absent from Vindolanda, so are the particularly advanced students of Latin missing from the soldier scribes at Bujem. Had there been constant linguistic training of new recruits, one might expect to find all levels of learning reflected in the written document at both sides. This, however, does not appear to be the case. Of course, we must accept the possibility that our evidence is simply inadequate and largely incapable of shedding sufficient light on such questions. More finds from Bujem, for instance, might change the impression we gain from the currently known ostraka. New finds from other military sites are also very likely to change the way in which we think about Latin in the Roman army. Perhaps then we may not yet have the means to get far beyond speculation in such matters. Nevertheless, one cannot help wondering whether the case of Vindolanda or that of Bujem was more typical of the linguistic situation in the auxilia of the Roman army. Evidently, the two cases are thousands of kilometers and around 150 years apart. Should we accept, therefore, that the general knowledge of Latin in the army and in the provincial society markedly deteriorated over this period? Or were the different levels of Latinity a cultural rather than a chronological function? At any rate, Kutus's writings appear to favor the former solution, as they and the 3rd century evidence of the Bujem ostraka match Tacitus's expression horridus sermo and his account of the Italian soldiers, whereas the advanced levels of Latin that we find in Vindolanda may perhaps have been in part influenced by the Batavians' close ties with Rome and the emperors. The Latin of the Vindolanda tablets might also have been influenced by two other factors. For many tablets were not written at Vindolanda, but elsewhere, and those that were indeed written there were from a relatively small circle of rather well-trained scribes. The Latin of the Vindolanda tablets therefore might not have been typical of the Latin spoken of most Vindolanda soldiers. Yet it is perhaps equally possible, or maybe even very likely, that units with different levels of Latinity coexisted at all times within all branches of the army. If true, the opportunities for recruits and soldiers to improve their Latin skills within their own unit might have been determined by the linguistic competencies found with the members of the administrative staff of one's unit. Mobility and outpost assignments may have provided additional opportunities to improve one's Latin, particularly if the relevant linguistic surrounding was favorable to such an endeavor. Centurions appointed from the rank and file may have improved their Latin on such occasions. In theory, however, that the theory, however, that the legions hired their own Latin teachers was never confirmed and is not at all likely. This theory was suggested based on the title Polio Legionis, known from a few inscriptions of the 2nd and 3rd centuries. The term polio was explained as deriving from the verb polire, to polish, and was thought to refer to efforts of brushing up someone's Latin. However, the evidence for this semantic field of polire is rather weak. Furthermore, it is not easy to reconcile this interpretation of the title polio with the inferior Latin of at least one inscription set up by a polio. Above all, however, poliones have so far become known only from the legions. They are missing in the evidence for the auxiliary troops, although that is precisely where we would expect to find Latin teachers most. The most likely explanation for the lack of evidence for professional Latin teachers in the Roman army is undoubtedly that such teachers simply did not exist. The permanent employment of professional translators was certainly not the solution that the Roman army adopted to overcome language barriers between the soldiers themselves and between the soldiers and their officers. The military translators that have become known through inscriptions and other texts all seem to have been responsible for the communication with foreign peoples. This was no doubt also true for this translator of the 15th Legion, who was also an important procurement agent of his unit. His sphere of activity was somewhere north of the Danube. But where then are the Latin teachers in the Roman army? They must have existed, for as we have seen, some teaching and learning of Latin did go on in the camps and fortresses. In fact, there is evidence that writing exercises and Latin lessons took place there, as writing exercises like the ones you see here were found at many Roman military sites. What is more, quotations from Virgil's works, written on wooden tablets or other material, were found in various Roman military forts. Most of these seem to have originated as writing exercises. Various texts on papyrus and ostraca show that soldiers often helped each other out when they had problems to overcome language barriers. Ethnic and linguistic groups that formed within the units, no doubt, usually offered sufficient opportunities to find someone who could translate or even teach Latin. This inscription mentions a group of men from Italy and the province of Noricum within the British Legio XXIII Victrix Pia Fidelis from around the mid-2nd century. Such groups are therefore very likely to have played a pivotal role in solving most language problems that may have emerged within a unit. Many new recruits would have found opportunities in such groups to improve their knowledge of Latin to at least the minimum level that made military service linguistically bearable. Ambitious Latin students may even have found suitable teachers in these circles. This inscription attests the existence of a club, if you like, of Thracians within the Equites Singularis Augusti. But we might also remember the cives reti from the beginning of this presentation. Reports about puns by soldiers, quotations from and allusions to works of classical Latin literature, as well as poems from some of their gravestones, attest to the claim of some soldiers and officers to have access to the traditional literary playgrounds of the Roman elite. You can see an example from Britain of such a poem on the gravestone of an eagle-bearer of the 14th Legion in this slide. He added an epigram of 4 hexameters to his epitaph. Sorry, that was too quick. After their discharge from the army, such soldiers evidently had sufficient knowledge of Latin to work as Latin teachers. One of them, it seems, was Cottonius Campanus, whose tombstone from Scarbantia in present-day Hungary is shown here. It will probably not surprise you that this epitaph is the only known direct testimony for a Latin teaching veteran. All in all, the surviving evidence appears to show both that there was a minimum of Latin each soldier in the army had to know, and that some instruction and learning of basic and advanced Latin and literacy indeed took place in the camps of the Roman army. Not all soldiers acquired decent levels of Latinity. Far from it. Not even all of those who served as scribes and clerks. But there were no doubt enough young men who were willing to learn Latin, as there were many advantages an ordinary soldier could hope for if he mastered the language of the Romans. Yet with respect to the army as a major agent for the spreading of Latin in the provinces, it is particularly important to take into account that the percentage of active soldiers and discharged veterans was absolutely tiny when compared to the empire's overall population. This was by far the single most important factor that limited the spreading of Latin by the members of the Roman army during the first 3 centuries. On the whole, therefore, and despite military service having been a particularly favorable environment for learning Latin, and as much as probably not insignificant numbers of soldiers in the West may have even acquired advanced levels of Latinity and literacy, the Roman army does not emerge as a major agent in the spreading of Latin in the provinces. Thank you very much.